Number 1. Kimberly Sayans. She moved through the hospital corridors in scrubs like any other nurse, blending into the quiet rhythm of a place built on trust. Patients greeted her with tired smiles, believing she was one of the people fighting to keep them alive. In a dialysis clinic, where every patient depends on machines to do the work their kidneys no longer can, trust isn't optional. It's survival. But behind Kimberly Sayans's calm face and professional posture was a darkness no one could have imagined. Kimberly Clark Sayans worked as a licensed vocational nurse at the DaVita Dialysis Clinic in Lufkin, Texas. On paper, she was just another healthcare worker, filling a demanding role in a high-stress environment. To colleagues and patients, she appeared functional, capable, and unremarkably ordinary. But beneath that surface was someone carrying out one of the most unsettling betrayals ever seen inside a medical facility. Dialysis patients rely on staff to monitor every detail of their treatment: blood flow rates, machine settings, lines, filters. A single mistake can be deadly. And Sayans wasn't making mistakes, she was creating them. In early 2008, a disturbing pattern emerged. Patients who had been stable for years suddenly began collapsing mid-treatment. Cardiac arrests, respiratory distress, violent reactions, episodes that seemed impossible during what should have been routine dialysis sessions. At first, staff and doctors blamed equipment failures, patient complications, or simple coincidence. But coincidences don't repeat themselves this often, or this precisely. And as the number of medical emergencies climbed, fear began to spread quietly among the staff. The situation escalated in April 2008. A coworker recalled seeing Sayans near a patient's dialysis tubing, her posture tense and hurried. Minutes later, that patient went into catastrophic distress. Something finally clicked. This wasn't just another medical anomaly. It looked intentional. The coworker reported her suspicions, and investigators were brought in. What they uncovered seemed almost unimaginable. Kimberly Sayans had been drawing bleach, the same bleach used to clean equipment, and injecting it into patients' dialysis lines. Once inside the bloodstream, bleach doesn't just damage tissue, it destroys it. It burns through veins, triggers organ failure, and sends the heart spiraling into fatal arrhythmias. The victims felt sudden sharp pain, burning sensations, or a wave of overwhelming dizziness before collapsing. Some were revived, others never recovered. 5 patients died. Many more narrowly survived. The investigation revealed that Sayans had convenient access to the cleaning stations, where bleach was stored in large quantities. Witnesses described seeing her lingering around supplies with no clear reason. Some noticed how the sudden emergencies always seemed to happen when she was assigned to certain stations. Slowly, a picture formed, not of an overwhelmed nurse making dangerous mistakes, but of someone deliberately weaponizing a substance no one would ever expect to be used against patients. But the biggest question, why, never received a satisfying answer. Some speculated about personal stress, marital problems at home, disciplinary issues at work, emotional instability. Others believed she might have craved attention, wanting to be the hero who noticed emergencies she secretly caused. But no motive ever fit neatly. In the end, the only certainty was the devastation she left behind. Survivors took the stand and described their horrifying experiences. One patient remembered an immediate burning sensation racing up her arm before everything faded. Another recalled Sayans standing over him moments before he lost consciousness. Doctors testified that the symptoms aligned perfectly with bleach exposure. Co-workers told the court what they had seen, including that fateful moment when suspicion finally turned into certainty. Sayans was arrested in 2008 and charged with 5 counts of capital murder and multiple counts of aggravated assault. The trial began in 2012, and prosecutors presented a methodical, chilling narrative. A nurse who abused her access and preyed on people who had no ability to defend themselves. The defense argued technical malfunction, medical complications, anything but deliberate poisoning, but the evidence towered too high. The pattern was undeniable. In March 2012, the jury found Kimberly Sayans guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No freedom, no second chance. She remains incarcerated today, spending her life behind bars while the families of her victims carry a different kind of life sentence, one filled with grief, confusion, and unanswered questions. Because the most haunting part of the Kimberly Sayans case isn't just the method or the deaths, it's the setting. A clinic meant to save lives, a nurse meant to protect them, and patients who walked through the doors hoping for healing, never imagining that the person hooking them up to the machine was the one quietly ending their lives. Number 2. Rudy Gued. Meredith Kercher arrived in Perugia full of excitement. A year abroad was supposed to be unforgettable in all the best ways. A chance to study, explore Italy, and build memories with new friends. She shared a small cottage with other students, including American exchange student Amanda Knox. Perugia was a picturesque university town, the kind of place where streets feel safe and life moves slowly. But on the night of November 1st, 2007, everything changed. Meredith stayed home while her roommates went out for the evening. She spoke to her family earlier that night, sounding happy and relaxed. But sometime after she hung up the phone, she was attacked inside her own bedroom. The next morning, when her friends couldn't reach her, authorities were called. What they found behind her locked door was a scene of extreme violence, blood on the floor, signs of a brutal struggle, and the heartbreaking reality that Meredith had been killed. The investigation intensified immediately. Italy's media descended on Perugia, and within days the case became international news. Early suspicion landed on Amanda Knox and her boyfriend, Rafael Solicito, whose confusing behavior and inconsistent statements drew attention. But as forensic teams combed through the evidence, a third name rose to the forefront: Rudy Herman Gued. Gued was a young man originally from the Ivory Coast who drifted within Perugia's social scene. He wasn't close friends with Meredith or her roommates, but he was known around town, sometimes for the wrong reasons. Investigators found his DNA in key locations at the crime scene: on Meredith's body, on her clothing, and on a bloody handprint left on a pillow. His DNA was also in the bathroom, mixed with Meredith's blood. These weren't vague or incidental traces. They pointed to direct involvement. While police were building their case, Gued fled Italy. He was located days later in Germany, where he was using library computers to read news about the murder. Authorities extradited him back to Italy, and by then, the evidence against him had solidified. Unlike Knox and Solicito, who fought lengthy legal battles, Guidi chose a fast-track trial, which offered the possibility of a reduced sentence in exchange for a quicker verdict. In October 2008, the court convicted him of the sexual assault and murder of Meredith Kercher. The judge concluded that Guid had participated directly in the attack, and he was initially sentenced to 30 years. On appeal, that sentence was reduced to 16. Throughout the process, Guid's version of events shifted repeatedly. He denied involvement, then admitted he was present, but claimed he didn't commit the murder. He said he heard Meredith scream, tried to help her, then panicked and fled. The physical evidence told a different story, one the courts ultimately believed. Meanwhile, the trials of Knox and Solicito exploded into a media storm, filled with sensational headlines, conflicting theories, and enormous public pressure. For years, Italian courts debated their involvement before ultimately acquitting them. Through all of this, Guidi's conviction remained the one piece of the case that never changed. After years in prison, Guidi was granted partial release to work outside during the day, and in 2021, he was fully released. His freedom reignited debate in Italy and abroad. Some believe he acted alone, pointing to the forensic evidence concentrated around him. Others argue that the attack involved more than one person. The truth may never be fully known. For Meredith Kercher's family, the legal battles, media frenzy, and conflicting narratives only deepened the tragedy. They consistently emphasized one simple fact: a bright, kind young woman lost her life in a place where she should have been safe. And despite the conviction, the lingering controversies surrounding the case mean that answers still feel incomplete. Rudy Guidi will forever be linked to a crime that shocked the world, but Meredith Kercher remains the heart of the story, a life full of promise, stolen in a moment of senseless violence. Number 3. Michael Gargiulo. To the people who lived around him, Michael Gargiulo was harmless, the guy who offered help without being asked, who fixed things, who smiled easily. He blended into neighborhoods with disarming ease, presenting himself as the friendly handyman who was always nearby. But behind that approachable exterior was a predator, quietly studying the women around him. He watched their daily routines, noted when they were home alone, and waited for the moments when they were most vulnerable. This double life would eventually earn him a name that chilled even seasoned detectives: the Hollywood Ripper. Gargiulo's violent trail began long before anyone realized. His first known victim was 18-year-old Tricia Picacho, killed outside her Illinois home in 1993. She was attacked on the front steps after a night out with friends, her life ending just feet from her family's front door. Gargiulo knew the Picacho family. He had spent time in their home. He was even seen as a friend. And although suspicion fell on him immediately, investigators at the time lacked the evidence they needed to bring charges. Tricia's case haunted detectives, but it would be years before they understood just how many more victims followed. Not long after, Gargiulo left Illinois and eventually moved to Southern California, a fresh start, a new city, and new targets. In Los Angeles, he worked a series of odd jobs, drifting between construction, maintenance, and labor work. But his real focus was on the women he encountered along the way. In 2001, he crossed paths with 22-year-old Ashley Alarin, a bright, outgoing fashion student who had recently moved to Hollywood. She lived just a few doors away from Gargiulo, who had taken an unsettling interest in her. On the night she was supposed to go on a date with actor Ashton Kutcher, she never made it out of the house. Kutcher arrived to pick her up, saw lights on and movement inside, but assumed she wasn't ready or had fallen asleep. The next morning, Ashley's roommate found her stabbed more than 40 times, a savage, frenzied attack that shocked investigators. Her killer had vanished without leaving a clear trail. 4 years later, the pattern repeated. In 2005, 32-year-old Maria Bruno, a newly divorced mother of 3, was murdered in her apartment just weeks after moving in. The brutality of the scene, the sheer number of stab wounds, the precision mixed with rage, suggested the same hand responsible for Ashley Ellerin's murder. But again, the killer was careful. There were no witnesses, no immediate suspects, and no obvious connection. Detectives feared they were dealing with someone highly organized and deeply predatory. Everything changed in 2008. That year, Gargiulo broke into the Santa Monica apartment of Michelle Murphy, a young woman who had no idea someone had been watching her. He attacked her as she slept, stabbing her repeatedly. But this time, the victim fought for her life. In the struggle, her resistance caught Gargiulo off guard. Michelle managed to push him off, scream, and force him to flee. As he escaped, he left behind vital DNA evidence, blood from a cut he sustained during the attack. When investigators ran the sample, it was a perfect match. Michelle's survival cracked open the cases that had remained unsolved for years. DNA connected Gargiulo not only to her attack, but to the murders of both Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno. As detectives dug deeper, they began revisiting older files. The Piccaccio murder from Illinois reemerged, and with advances in forensic testing, evidence finally placed Gargiulo at that crime scene too. In 2019, after years of delays and preparation, the trial began. Prosecutors laid out a chilling timeline of calculated stalking and extreme violence. They described how Gargiulo targeted women who lived near him, inserting himself into their lives just long enough to gain information, and then attacking them inside the very homes where they felt safest. They called him a serial sexual thrill killer, someone who derives satisfaction from inflicting terror and exerting absolute control. The defense tried to argue the cases were circumstantial, or that DNA alone didn't prove intent. But the pattern was undeniable, and the testimony of Michelle Murphy, who faced him in court, was devastating. The jury found Michael Gargiulo guilty on all counts, 2 murders and 1 attempted murder. In 2021, he was sentenced to death. But with California's ongoing moratorium on executions, he is expected to remain on death row indefinitely. The thought that someone so violent could present himself as a harmless neighbor is what makes this case so unsettling. Gargiulo didn't hide in the shadows. He stood in plain sight, helping carry groceries, offering to fix appliances, nodding politely to the women he would later stalk. His victims never suspected the danger living just beyond their front door. That's the true horror of Michael Gargiulo, a killer who didn't just blend in, he made himself useful. Number 4. Gary Hilton. The Appalachian Trail, the Chattahoochee National Forest, the sprawling woodlands of Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. These are places people visit to find solitude, breathe fresh air, and disconnect from everyday stress. For thousands of hikers, these trails represent freedom. But for Gary Michael Hilton, they were something far more sinister. Isolated, quiet hunting grounds where victims could vanish without a trace. Hilton was a drifter in his 60s, living almost entirely out of a white van cluttered with camping gear, old clothes, and makeshift survival supplies. He wasn't the type of person hikers feared. Scruffy, weathered, talkative, he blended into the outdoor community. People who crossed paths with him assumed he was just another eccentric outdoorsman. But beneath that harmless facade was a violent predator who spent years roaming America's forests, watching, approaching, and eventually targeting unsuspecting hikers. His most widely known victim was 24-year-old Meredith Emerson, an athletic and experienced hiker who set out on New Year's Day 2008 to hike Blood Mountain in Georgia. She took her dog Ella along, a routine outing for her. But when she didn't return home, friends and family knew immediately that something was wrong. Witnesses reported seeing Meredith talking to an older man on the trail earlier that day. No one realized they were describing Gary Hilton. For days, the search for Meredith grew into one of the largest in Georgia's history. Thousands of volunteers joined law enforcement, combing rugged terrain and hoping for any clue. Then, a chilling discovery. Meredith's dog was found wandering alone miles from where she had last been seen. Ella was unharmed, but Meredith was still missing. The break investigators needed came from surveillance footage. Cameras captured Hilton attempting to withdraw money using Meredith's ATM card. That footage led directly to his arrest. During questioning, he cracked. Hilton admitted to kidnapping Meredith, holding her captive for several days, and ultimately killing her. In exchange for revealing the location of her body, he struck a deal that removed the death penalty option in Georgia. But as detectives began digging deeper into Hilton's past movements, a horrifying pattern emerged. In late 2007, John and Irene Bryant, an elderly couple from Florida known for their love of hiking, disappeared while exploring the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina. Weeks later, Irene's body was found in the woods. John's remains were discovered months after that. Their credit card had been used by Gary Hilton. Evidence placed him near their final known location and along their travel route. Then, in December 2007, another case unfolded in Florida. Cheryl Dunlap, a 46-year-old nurse and avid hiker, went missing while exploring the Apalachicola National Forest. When her body was discovered, parts of it had been burned. Surveillance footage from an ATM showed a man trying to withdraw money using her card, his face covered, but his posture, voice, and clothing unmistakably matching Hilton's description. These weren't random killings. Hilton followed a deliberate pattern. He approached hikers who were alone or vulnerable. He used friendly conversation to lower their guard. He robbed them, sometimes held them hostage for a short time, and then killed them, often brutally. He used the vast forest as a shield, knowing search efforts would be slow, complicated, and easily overwhelmed by the wilderness. By 2008, the truth was undeniable. Hilton wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial killer operating across multiple states, using national forests as his camouflage. He was eventually convicted in 3 states. In Georgia, he received a life sentence for Meredith Emerson's murder as part of his plea deal. In North Carolina, he was given another life sentence for killing the Bryants. In Florida, where the death penalty remained active, he was convicted of killing Cheryl Dunlap and sentenced to death. Today, Hilton sits on Florida's death row. He is an aging man now, but the fear he inspired still lingers in the hiking community. His case changed how many people approach outdoor safety, reminding hikers that even the most peaceful trails can hide hidden dangers. Gary Hilton didn't look like a monster. That was his greatest weapon. He blended into the very environment where he hunted, quietly, calmly, until it was too late for the people who crossed his path. Number 5. Keith Gibson. Keith Gibson's story is one that exposes the darkest failure of the parole system, because when he was given a second chance, instead of rebuilding his life, he unleashed a wave of violence that would devastate families across 2 states. Gibson had been in and out of prison for years, mostly for robberies and violent offenses. He was no stranger to the criminal justice system. But in 2020, when he was released on parole in Delaware, officials believed he could re-enter society without posing a major threat. They were wrong. Not long after his release, tragedy struck close to home. In early 2021, Gibson's own mother, 54-year-old Christine Gibson, was found beaten to death inside her Wilmington residence. Her home had been ransacked, and she had been robbed. Police almost immediately suspected her son, given his history and their strained relationship. But by the time her body was discovered, Keith Gibson was already gone, moving between states, drifting from place to place, and growing increasingly unstable and violent. What followed was a series of crimes so cold-blooded and calculated that seasoned detectives compared Gibson to a modern-day spree killer. Over the next several months, Gibson carried out a string of robberies across Delaware and Pennsylvania. He targeted cell phone stores, convenience shops, and pharmacies, businesses with young or vulnerable employees, places where he could strike fast and disappear just as quickly. But these weren't typical robberies. Gibson didn't threaten violence, he committed it. He would enter a store, demand cash, and then execute employees even after they complied. His killings were swift, deliberate, and often captured on camera. In Philadelphia, he walked into a cell phone store and shot a 21-year-old clerk in the head at point-blank range. The young man had followed every instruction, but was murdered anyway. In Delaware, Gibson entered a Rite Aid pharmacy and killed a female employee during another robbery. The pattern became unmistakable. Gibson didn't kill out of panic. He killed because he wanted to. Victims included employees, customers, and random people who crossed paths with him. None had provoked him. None had any connection to him. They were simply unlucky enough to encounter a man who viewed human life as disposable. As the violence escalated, law enforcement agencies across Delaware and Pennsylvania coordinated a multi-state manhunt. Gibson's face circulated on news broadcasts and social media. Community fear soared as investigators linked him to more and more cases, including additional shootings and attempted murders. For months, he managed to slip through cracks, moving between cities, changing locations, and leaving devastation behind. In June 2021, everything came to a head. Philadelphia police spotted Gibson during an attempted robbery. A foot chase erupted through the city streets. Officers tackled and arrested him, bringing an end to his spree. At the time of his arrest, Gibson was armed, wearing a bulletproof vest, and carrying ammunition, prepared for more violence. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Clear surveillance footage, ballistic matches connecting his gun to multiple murders, eyewitnesses, and his own incriminating behavior. In 2023, Gibson was convicted in Pennsylvania on multiple counts, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and robbery. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Delaware, where he still faces charges for additional murders, including his mother's, is expected to impose further sentences that could keep him incarcerated until death. Keith Gibson's rampage triggered intense scrutiny of the parole board's decision to release him in the first place. Critics argued that his record, combined with his history of violence, should have prevented his release entirely. Families of the victims questioned how such a dangerous individual had been allowed back into society without strict oversight. The tragedy of the Keith Gibson case lies not only in the number of lives lost, but in how avoidable some of those deaths may have been. His victims were everyday people, store clerks, workers, community members, who woke up expecting an ordinary day. Instead, they crossed paths with a man who had already decided none of them would live through the encounter. Keith Gibson was given a second chance. The people he killed never got one. Number 6. Anthony Garcia. Revenge can be quiet at first, a simmering resentment, a feeling of injustice that gnaws at the mind. But for Anthony Garcia, that simmer turned into a consuming obsession, a mission that would span years and claim multiple lives. His story is a chilling example of how personal vendettas, left unchecked, can erupt into lethal violence. Garcia was a pathologist, trained at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. On paper, he had a bright future in medicine, but reality did not match expectation. He struggled through residency programs, clashed with supervisors, and in 2001, he was dismissed from his position at Creighton. To Garcia, this was not simply a career setback. It was a profound humiliation. He blamed specific individuals for what he perceived as a deliberate sabotage of his professional life. That bitterness festered for more than a decade. For years, Garcia moved from job to job, seemingly trying to maintain a normal life, but behind the surface he was plotting. He never forgot the perceived wrongs, nor did he let the idea of revenge fade. In his mind, justice had to be served, and he would be the arbiter. By 2008, he had decided it was time to act, and his targets were carefully chosen, people he held personally responsible for his downfall. Garcia's first attack was indirect. He targeted Thomas Hunter, the son of Dr. William Hunter, one of the physicians connected to his dismissal. Thomas, only a teenager at the time, and his housekeeper, Shirley Sherman, were found brutally stabbed to death in their Omaha home. The violence was savage, excessive, and deeply personal in its precision. Despite the brutality, the case initially went cold. Garcia remained under the radar, blending back into ordinary life, watching, waiting, and planning his next move. 5 years later, in 2013, Garcia struck again. Dr. Roger Brumbach, another physician tied to his dismissal, and Brumbach's wife Mary were found murdered in their Omaha home. Like the Hunter killings, the attack was methodical, executed with knives in a way that suggested both anger and planning. The similarities between the two cases drew investigators' attention, prompting them to consider connections that had previously been overlooked. Detectives discovered that Garcia had been living in the area during both sets of murders. He had the means, opportunity, and mobility to strike without immediate detection. Surveillance footage placed his car near both crime scenes, and credit card records confirmed his presence in Omaha at critical times. DNA evidence ultimately provided the irrefutable link needed to tie him to the crimes. In 2013, Garcia was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors painted a chilling portrait: a man who had allowed years of resentment and anger to metastasize into lethal action, meticulously planning each attack against people he believed had ruined his life. The murders were not impulsive. They were premeditated, deliberate, and executed with an unnerving calm. The defense attempted to frame the case as circumstantial, but the pattern was undeniable. Garcia had motive, opportunity, and the means to carry out his attacks. In 2016, the jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. Anthony Garcia's crimes demonstrate the deadly potential of unchecked bitterness and obsession. He had the intelligence, the education, and the professional skills to create a meaningful life, but instead, he allowed resentment to consume him. 4 innocent people, young and old, lost their lives because of one man's inability to let go of perceived slights. His story is a grim reminder of how personal vendettas, nurtured over years, can transform a capable individual into a methodical killer. Number 7. Jesse Dotson family is supposed to be a source of safety, a bond that protects and nurtures. But for Jesse Dotson's relatives, that bond became their deadliest threat. Dotson had a long history of violence. In 1994, he was convicted of second-degree murder after killing a man during a botched drug deal and spent years in prison. By 2007, he was released, given what authorities hoped was a second chance to reintegrate into society. Dotson settled in Memphis, Tennessee, reconnecting with his family and attempting to appear normal. On the surface, he seemed to be putting his past behind him. But beneath that veneer, anger, resentment, and instability simmered. Those tensions erupted violently in February 2008, turning a family gathering into a scene of unimaginable horror. It began with an argument at his brother Cecil's house, over money, drugs, or perceived slights. The exact cause is unclear. But the argument escalated far beyond words. Jesse Dotson didn't just fight his brother, he methodically turned on everyone in the home, attacking his brother's girlfriend, Marissa Williams, and his nephews, 4-year-old Samario and 2-year-old Cecil Jr. Friends visiting the home were also caught in the violent spree. Each attack was deliberate, showing a chilling combination of rage and control. When the carnage ended, 6 people were dead. 2 children, barely older than toddlers, suffered fatal injuries. The brutality left Memphis in shock. The sheer scale of the violence inside a single home was unprecedented in recent memory. Amid the devastation, there was one survivor. A 9-year-old boy, found days later, had miraculously lived despite severe injuries. His testimony became critical in piecing together what had happened and confirming Dotson's role as the assailant. Authorities quickly arrested Jesse Dotson. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts, forensic analysis, and the child's recollection painted a clear and harrowing picture. There was no room for doubt. The trial, which began in 2010, detailed the horror in a methodical way. Prosecutors described how Dotson had moved through the house, attacking each victim with precision, leaving no one untouched by his rage. The defense tried to argue mitigating circumstances, but the scale and brutality of the murders left little room for sympathy or doubt. In 2010, Dotson was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He remains on Tennessee's death row, a grim reminder of the violence that can erupt even within the walls of a home. The tragedy left lasting scars on the community. Questions lingered. How could someone inflict such terror on their own family? How do survivors, especially children, rebuild when the violence came from someone they should have trusted most? Jesse Dotson's name is forever tied to one of Memphis's most senseless and horrifying family murders, and the wounds he left behind remain raw. Number 8. Joseph Brandt. Hurricane Katrina left New Orleans in ruins in 2005. Entire neighborhoods were submerged, homes destroyed, and the city's infrastructure and law enforcement was overwhelmed. Amid the chaos, vulnerable populations were left exposed, struggling to survive. It was in this fractured environment that Joseph Brandt found opportunity, preying on those society often overlooked. Brandt didn't commit crimes that made headlines at first. He operated quietly, choosing victims who were marginalized, women involved in substance use, struggling with unstable housing, or living on the fringes of the city. He would approach them under the guise of friendliness, earn their trust, and then strike. Many were found days later, abandoned in alleys, empty lots, or derelict buildings, far from any eyes that might have noticed their disappearance immediately. The pattern began to emerge in late 2007. The first body was discovered, followed by another, and then another. All were women, all had been strangled or beaten, and all were left in similar isolated locations. The New Orleans Police Department, still grappling with the aftermath of Katrina and reduced staffing, struggled to keep pace with the growing list of murders. Resources were stretched thin, and the city was still in recovery, making investigations slow and complex. Eventually, law enforcement began to zero in on Brandt. Witnesses recalled seeing him with some of the victims shortly before their disappearances. Forensic evidence tied him to multiple crime scenes, and his inconsistent statements raised further suspicion. The trail led investigators to a clear suspect, a man who had exploited the disorder around him to commit calculated acts of violence. Brandt was arrested in 2008 and faced multiple counts of murder. The prosecution argued that he deliberately targeted those who were less likely to be missed, using the post-Katrina chaos to mask his actions. He selected victims not for personal reasons, but because they were vulnerable, invisible to the system, and often dismissed by society. The trial brought to light the chilling details of his crimes. Brandt showed no remorse. He had stalked, lured, and murdered with deliberate precision, believing his victims' marginalized status would shield him from justice. But prosecutors and families made it clear that these were lives that mattered, women with families, friends, and futures. Each victim had a story, and the jury was reminded of their humanity. In 2010, Joseph Brandt was convicted on multiple counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated today, a stark example of how predators can exploit disaster and societal neglect to commit violent crimes. The case underscored a painful truth. In the aftermath of catastrophe, danger doesn't only come from nature. It can also come from those who see vulnerability as opportunity. Joseph Brandt's crimes serve as a grim reminder that even in recovery, vigilance is necessary, and that every life, no matter how overlooked, deserves protection and justice. Number 9. Nicholas Troy Sheely. In June 2008, Fear gripped the Midwest as communities in Illinois and Missouri were shaken by a week-long killing spree. 8 people would lose their lives at the hands of Nicholas Troy Sheely, a man with a long history of violence and a total disregard for human life. Sheely's rampage began on June 23rd in Rock Falls, Illinois. His first victim was attacked with a hammer, the weapon he would repeatedly use in the days ahead. The assault was swift, brutal, and unprovoked, a harrowing introduction to the terror that would follow. Over the next week, Sheely moved across state lines, striking at random. Some of his victims were acquaintances, but many were complete strangers. A married couple in their home, a hitchhiker picked up along the road, a child and his parents, all became targets of his frenzied, unrelenting violence. The attacks lacked any discernible pattern beyond chaos and sheer cruelty, leaving investigators scrambling to connect the crimes. Law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions coordinated frantic efforts. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching Sheely's description near various crime scenes. Surveillance cameras captured his movements, and as the death toll rose, the manhunt intensified. Entire communities were paralyzed with fear, unsure who would be next. Finally, on June 30th, 2008, Sheely was apprehended in Granite City, Illinois. A bar owner had recognized him from news reports and called police. He was taken into custody without incident, bringing an end to a week that had left the Midwest in shock and mourning. Sheely faced 8 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Eyewitness testimony, forensic links to the crime scenes, and tracking of his movements through surveillance and credit card records left no doubt about his culpability. In 2013, he was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A plea agreement spared him the death penalty, but it guaranteed that he would never walk free again. The aftermath of Sheely's spree left deep scars on the communities affected. 8 lives, spanning ages and backgrounds, were extinguished in a matter of days. For one terrifying week in June 2008, the Midwest experienced a level of fear and uncertainty that would be remembered for years, a chilling reminder of the destructive potential of a single violent individual. Number 10. Kermit Gosnell. Some crimes are so grotesque, they force society to confront the darkest corners of human behavior. Kermit Gosnell's case is one such instance, a shocking example of how power, trust, and vulnerability can be manipulated with devastating consequences. For decades, Gosnell operated a clinic in West Philadelphia that outwardly presented itself as a women's health center offering reproductive services. On paper, it appeared legitimate, but inside, the facility was a site of medical neglect, regulatory violations, and acts that defy comprehension. The clinic was unsanitary. Equipment was filthy. Inspection records were ignored, and basic safety protocols were routinely violated. It is astonishing that the clinic remained open for so long, given the dangerous conditions. Women, many from low-income backgrounds and vulnerable situations, came seeking care, only to encounter a nightmare. Gosnell performed illegal late-term procedures, far beyond what the law permitted. In the most horrifying revelations, witnesses testified that infants who were born alive during these procedures were killed by Gosnell, who severed their spinal cords with scissors. He spoke of these acts casually, as though they were routine medical practices. Former employees described the environment as chaotic and unsafe, with no oversight or accountability. The clinic also operated as an illegal prescription pill mill, drawing federal scrutiny. By 2010, authorities raided the facility, uncovering the full extent of the horror: fetal remains improperly stored, unsafe surgical practices, and testimony from staff detailing a culture of fear and complicity. Gosnell was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, infanticide, and performing illegal late-term procedures. The trial, beginning in 2013, revealed the chilling realities of his clinic. Employees testified about the shocking lack of hygiene, the absence of medical standards, and the deliberate actions Gosnell took to harm his patients and infants. The defense attempted to frame Gosnell as a provider for women with nowhere else to turn, but the prosecution dismantled this narrative, showing that this was not about care. It was about exploitation, profit, and a complete disregard for human life. In May 2013, Kermit Gosnell was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and numerous other charges. He received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now in his 80s, he remains incarcerated, a grim symbol of medical betrayal and cruelty. The case sparked national debate over regulation, oversight, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Beyond the political discourse, however, it was a story of profound human loss: women harmed, infants killed, and a community betrayed by someone who used the guise of medicine to commit unspeakable acts. Kermit Gosnell's name is forever etched into American history as a reminder of the depths of human depravity, and the victims, both the living and the lost, remain at the heart of this tragic story.